She stared at the cash register. A crumpled 20, a 10, and 3 damp singles. $33. The exact price of her survival. She handed it all to a soaked, stranded stranger. 2 days later, the deafening roar of 100 Hell's Angels shattered the town's silence, seeking her. The cracked neon sign outside Maggie's Route 41 diner had been buzzing like a dying wasp for 3 years. Nestled on the dusty outskirts of coarse gold, California, the diner was a relic of a bygone era, much like Maggie O'Connor herself. At 64, Maggie's hands were scarred from decades of hot grease and harsh bleach, her shoulders bowed under the weight of a life that refused to cut her a single break. It was a Tuesday evening, and the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the drought-stricken California dirt into a slick, treacherous mud. Inside, the diner was dead. The coffee in the pot had turned to bitter sludge, and the silence was only broken by the rhythmic, wheezing breaths of her 7-year-old grandson Toby, who was asleep in the corner booth with his head resting on a dog-eared math workbook. Maggie stood behind the counter, staring into the open drawer of the cash register. Inside lay a single, torn $20 bill, held together by yellowing Scotch tape, a crisp 10, and 3 damp ones. $33. That was her entire net worth. It was the only thing standing between her and total ruin. Tomorrow morning, Richard Coburn, the ruthless property manager who had spent the last 8 months buying up every struggling business on the highway for a corporate truck stop developer, was coming to collect. She was exactly $33 short of the minimum partial payment required to stop the foreclosure of the diner and the attached trailer she and Toby called home. Maggie closed her eyes, fighting the familiar burn of tears. She had lost her husband, Bill, to a sudden heart attack 5 years ago. 2 years later, her daughter was taken by a reckless drunk driver, leaving Toby in Maggie's care. She had fought tooth and nail to keep the diner afloat, flipping burgers and pouring coffee for truckers who were becoming increasingly scarce. But the town was dying, and Richard Coburn was the vulture circling its remains. The sharp jingle of the front doorbell snapped her eyes open. A gust of freezing rain blew into the diner, rattling the napkin dispensers. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like he had been spat out by the storm itself. He was colossal, easily 6'4", with a thick, rain-soaked beard and eyes as hard as flint. He wore heavy leather boots, denim stained with motor oil, and a thick leather vest. Even in the dim light, Maggie could see the unmistakable red and white patches on his chest and back. Hell's Angels. In a small town like Coarse Gold, the name alone usually made people cross the street and lock their doors. But Maggie didn't flinch. She just saw a man shivering, water pooling at his boots, looking exhausted and beaten down by the elements. The giant of a man closed the door against the wind and took off his soaked leather gloves, wiping the water from his face. He looked around the empty diner, his gaze briefly lingering on the sleeping boy in the booth before meeting Maggie's eyes. "We're closed," Maggie said, her voice softer than she intended. "I know," the man rumbled, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in his chest. "I saw the sign go dark. I need to use your phone, ma'am, if you'll let me." Maggie grabbed a rag and wiped down the counter. "Phone's on the wall by the restrooms. Local calls are free. Long distance takes quarters." The biker let out a heavy sigh, his massive shoulders slumping. "That's the problem. I don't have quarters. I don't have anything." He walked slowly to the counter, taking a seat on one of the cracked vinyl stools. Up close, Maggie could see the deep lines of exhaustion carved into his face. hit a patch of black ice and blown rubber about 2 miles back. Bike went down into the embankment. I lost my saddlebags, my wallet, my phone. Everything washed down the ravine in the mudslide. I've been walking for an hour. Maggie looked at him. He was a terrifying figure to most, an outlaw by society's standards. His knuckles were heavily tattooed, spelling out words she couldn't quite read in the shadows, but his hands were shaking from the biting cold. "Let me get you a cup of coffee," Maggie said, turning to a fresh pot she had just started brewing for herself. She poured a heavy ceramic mug full of the steaming black liquid and set it in front of him. "I told you I can't pay for it," he said, looking down at the mug as if it were a mirage. "I didn't ask for your money," Maggie replied, sliding a plate of leftover cherry pie toward him. "Eat. You look like you're going to pass out in my diner, and I don't have the strength to drag you outside." A faint ghost of a smile touched the biker's lips. "Thank you." He ate the pie in 3 massive bites and drained half the coffee, closing his eyes as the warmth hit his system. "My name is Clayton," he said, looking up at her. "Most people call me Bones." "I'm Maggie. That's Toby over there." Clayton nodded toward the boy. "He shouldn't be sleeping in a diner." "He's got asthma," Maggie said, her voice tightening defensively. "The trailer gets drafty in the rain, makes his chest tight. It's warmer in here by the ovens." Clayton's eyes softened, taking in the dilapidated state of the diner, the rusted fryers, the patched-up ceiling. He saw the desperation Maggie was trying so hard to hide. "I need to get to Fresno," Clayton said quietly. "My chapter. My brothers are down there. If I can just get to a payphone and get someone on the line, they'll come to get me. But the local tow company down the road, guy named Clyde, said he won't pull my bike out of the mud unless I hand him $30 cash up front. Says he doesn't trust my kind." Maggie's breath hitched. $30. She looked at the cash register. Inside was the $33, the exact amount she needed to hand Richard Coburn in the morning to buy herself a 2-week extension on her eviction. If she didn't have it, Coburn would lock the doors by noon. "If my bike sits in that mud all night, the engine will flood completely. It's custom," Clayton said, his voice laced with a quiet desperation that felt painfully familiar to Maggie. "It's the only thing I own in this world." Maggie stared at the massive biker. She thought about her own life. She thought about Richard Coburn, his smug smile, his expensive suits, the way he looked at her, like she was dirt beneath his designer shoes. She knew that even if she gave Coburn the $33, it was only delaying the inevitable. He would find another way to force her out. The game was rigged against people like her. But right here, right now, she had the power to actually help someone. She had the power to save this man's livelihood. Without saying a word, Maggie walked over to the register. She hit the button. The drawer popped open with a sad ding. She reached in, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the drawer, and pulled out the crumpled 20, the 10, and the 3 damp singles. She walked back to the counter and placed the money in front of Clayton. Clayton froze, staring at the crumpled bills. "What is this?" "It's $33, Maggie said, her voice steady. "Clyde charges $30 for a winch out. Use the other $3 to buy a hot chocolate from his vending machine while you wait. He's a stubborn old mule, but if you wave cash in his face, he'll pull your bike out." Clayton didn't touch the money. He looked from the bills up to Maggie's weary eyes. "Maggie, I can't take this. I saw you staring at that register. That's all you have, isn't it?" "It doesn't matter what it is," Maggie lied, lifting her chin. "Consider it a loan. You can pay me back when you find your wallet." Clayton stood up slowly, towering over her. He reached out with a massive, calloused hand and gently picked up the money. He didn't say a word for a long time. He just looked at her, his dark eyes memorizing her face, the diner, the sleeping boy in the corner. "You're a good woman, Maggie O'Connor," Clayton said softly, reading her name tag. He carefully folded the bills and placed them in the inner pocket of his leather cut. "I won't forget this. The angels don't forget." He turned and walked out into the freezing rain, the bells jingling behind him. Maggie stood alone in the quiet diner. She walked over to the cash register and pushed the empty drawer shut. It sounded like a coffin closing. She had just given away her survival, her home, her grandson's security, to a complete stranger. She sank to the floor behind the counter, pulled her knees to her chest, and wept silently into the dark. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a harsh, unforgiving grey sky. At exactly 7 a.m., the low hum of the diner's ancient refrigerators choked, sputtered, and died. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once before plunging the room into shadows. Maggie, who hadn't slept a wink, was wiping down tables in the gloom. The power company had finally cut the cord. "Grandma, it's cold," Toby said, rubbing his eyes as he sat up in the booth, pulling his thin jacket tighter around his small frame. "I know, baby," Maggie said, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. "Go pack your backpack. Put your favorite toys in there, okay? We're going to be taking a little trip today." She hadn't even finished the sentence when the crunch of tires on gravel echoed outside. A sleek, silver Mercedes pulled into the muddy lot, looking violently out of place in front of the rusted diner. Richard Coburn stepped out. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, carrying a leather briefcase and an umbrella that he held defensively against the light drizzle. Two men flanked him, local sheriff's deputies, looking deeply uncomfortable. Maggie's heart dropped into her stomach. She walked to the front door and unlocked it, stepping out onto the porch to meet them, blocking their view of Toby inside. "Morning, Maggie," Coburn said, a sickeningly sweet smile plastered across his face. "I see the power company finally caught up with you. Saves me a call." "You're early, Richard," Maggie said, her jaw clenched. "The notice said I had until noon." "Yes, well, the paperwork also said you needed to produce a minimum payment of $33 by close of business yesterday to initiate the grace period," Coburn said, snapping his briefcase open. He pulled out a laminated sheet of paper. "My office received no such payment, so the grace period is void. The property belongs to Horizon Developments as of 8 a.m. "Richard, please," Maggie whispered, her pride shattering as the reality set in. "I have a grandson. It's raining. Just give me the weekend to clear out my things. I'll leave the fryers. I'll leave the furniture. Just let us stay in the trailer until Sunday." Coburn sighed, adjusting his expensive tie. "Maggie, it's not personal. It's progress. The demolition crews are scheduled for Monday morning. We need the site secured and fenced off by this afternoon. You have 2 hours to remove your personal belongings. The deputies will stay here to ensure nothing permanent goes missing." He stepped forward and ruthlessly slapped the red and white "Foreclosed" sign on the diner's front window, right over the fading letters of Maggie's name. "2 hours, Maggie," Coburn sneered. He turned on his heel, walked back to his Mercedes, and drove away, leaving her standing in the cold with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of ash. The next 2 hours were a blur of trauma. Maggie and Toby stuffed their entire lives into heavy-duty black garbage bags and cardboard boxes from the pantry. The deputies stood by silently. One of them, a young man Maggie had known since he was a teenager, looked like he was fighting back tears, but orders were orders. By 10:30 a.m., Maggie and Toby were sitting on an overturned milk crate at the edge of the property line, near the highway. Around them sat 4 garbage bags and 2 boxes. It was all they had left in the world. The rain had stopped, giving way to a heavy, suffocating humidity. The town of Coarsegold was waking up, and cars drove by. People Maggie had served coffee to for 30 years averted their eyes, driving faster when they saw her sitting there. The shame was suffocating. "Where are we going to sleep tonight, Grandma?" Toby asked, his voice trembling as he clutched a worn-out stuffed bear. "I don't know, baby," Maggie whispered, pulling him into her side. "But we're together. That's what matters." She looked down at her empty hands. She thought about Clayton. She wondered if he had made it to Fresno. She wondered if giving away that $33 was the stupidest thing she had ever done. It wouldn't have saved the diner. Coburn's presence this morning proved that, but it might have bought them a night in a cheap motel instead of the streets. No, she told herself, she couldn't regret kindness. If she let the world make her bitter, she truly had nothing left. Noon approached. The heat of the afternoon sun began to bake the damp asphalt. Richard Coburn returned, this time with a flatbed truck carrying chain-link fencing. He stepped out, directing the workers with arrogant waves of his hands. "Make sure the perimeter is tight," Coburn barked at the workers. He glanced over at Maggie and Toby, sitting by the road, a smirk playing on his lips. "I told you, Maggie, you need to vacate the frontage. You're loitering on private property now." Maggie didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs felt like lead. "Did you hear me?" Coburn snapped, marching toward her. "I will have the deputies arrest you for trespassing if you don't." He stopped. The ground beneath Maggie's feet began to vibrate. It wasn't a sudden jolt, but a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to echo up from the very bedrock of the earth. Toby looked up, his eyes wide. "Grandma, is it an earthquake?" Maggie frowned, looking down the long, empty stretch of Highway 41. The vibrations grew stronger. The leftover puddles in the gravel parking lot began to ripple in tiny, concentric circles. Then the sound hit them. It was a deep, guttural roar, like thunder trapped in a canyon, growing louder and more ferocious by the second. Coburn's workers dropped their tools, turning to look down the highway. The 2 deputies stepped out of their cruiser, hands instinctively dropping to their belts. Over the crest of the hill, a mile down the road, a dark mass appeared. At first it looked like a black cloud rolling over the asphalt. But as it crested the hill, the sun caught the gleaming chrome of heavy exhaust pipes and polished handlebars. Motorcycles, not just a few. Dozens of them. Row after row of massive Harley-Davidsons, riding in perfect military-style formation. The deafening roar of their V-twin engines echoed off the pine trees, shaking the leaves from the branches. Leading the pack was a colossal, custom-built chopper, its extended forks glinting fiercely in the daylight. Coburn took a step back, his face draining of color. What is this?" he stammered, looking at the deputies, who were completely frozen in shock. The massive column of bikers didn't blow past the diner. As the lead rider approached the property line, he raised a single, black-gloved fist into the air. In perfect unison, 100 motorcycles downshifted, the explosive backfire sounding like heavy artillery. The riders turned their wheels, swarming into the muddy parking lot of Maggie's Route 41 diner. They parked in immaculate, staggered rows, effectively surrounding Coburn's silver Mercedes and the work trucks. The engines cut out one by one, leaving a sudden, ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise. 100 men dismounted. They wore heavy leather boots, dark jeans, and vests adorned with the winged death head. The Hells Angels had arrived, and they brought the entire weight of their Brotherhood with them. The townsfolk who were driving by slammed on their brakes, causing a minor traffic jam on the highway. Shop owners across the street locked their doors and peered through the blinds in absolute terror. Richard Coburn was trembling, his arrogant posture completely collapsing as the sea of leather and denim parted. Walking down the center of the formation was the giant from the night before, Clayton Bones Miller. He wasn't covered in mud anymore. His leather cut was clean, his boots shined, and the patches on his chest gleamed with a terrifying authority. He didn't even look at Coburn. His dark, intense eyes were locked entirely on Maggie, who was still sitting on the milk crate, clutching Toby to her chest. Clayton walked slowly toward her, the gravel crunching under his boots, 100 of his brothers standing silently behind him, watching. "I told you, Maggie." Clayton's deep voice boomed through the dead silence of the lot. "The angels don't forget." Clayton stood before Maggie, his massive frame blocking out the harsh midday sun. He reached down, offering a scarred, calloused hand. Maggie stared at it for a second before placing her trembling fingers into his palm. He pulled her to her feet with shocking gentleness, then looked down at Toby, offering the boy a reassuring wink. You came back," Maggie breathed, still clutching her garbage bag as if it were a shield. "I told you I would," Clayton rumbled. He reached into his leather vest and pulled out the exact same crumpled 20, 10, and 3 damp singles she had given him. He pressed them gently back into her hand. "I'm returning the loan. But my brothers and I felt the interest rate needed a little adjusting." "Now, see here." Richard Coburn's voice cracked, sounding like a panicked teenager as he tried to regain his authority. He stepped out from behind his silver Mercedes, brandishing his laminated foreclosure notice like a weapon. "This is private property. Horizon Developments owns this land, and you all are trespassing. Deputies, arrest them." The 2 deputies didn't move a muscle. One of them actually took a deliberate step backward, lowering his gaze to his boots. You didn't need to read the penal code to know that 2 badges and 2 sidearms meant absolutely nothing against 100 patched Hell's Angels. Clayton slowly turned around to face Coburn. The sea of bikers parted, forming a tight, impenetrable wall around the property line. "You must be Richard Coburn," Clayton said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. He walked toward the developer, his heavy boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel. "I had a nice long chat with the regional manager of the First National Bank of Fresno this morning. Seems he's a big fan of vintage motorcycles. We had coffee. Talked about you." Coburn's face went paper white. "The bank has nothing to do with this. The foreclosure is finalized." "Not exactly," a voice called out. A tall, surprisingly clean-cut biker, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a secretary patch, stepped forward from the pack. His name was Sullivan, and beneath his leather cut, he was a ruthless corporate attorney who handled the club's legal affairs. Sullivan pulled a thick stack of manila folders from his saddlebag and tossed them onto the hood of Coburn's Mercedes. "You see, Ricky, you were so eager to kick a widow out on the street over $33 that you violated Section 4 of the California Homeowner Bill of Rights. You didn't provide the mandatory 30-day written notice of default before initiating the seizure of the attached residential trailer, which means this foreclosure is illegal." "Void," Coburn sputtered, his eyes darting frantically between the documents and the massive men surrounding him. That's a clerical error. I'll have my lawyers fix it by tomorrow." "You won't have the chance," Clayton interrupted, stepping so close to Coburn that the developer flinched, shrinking back against his car. Clayton reached into his pocket and pulled out a certified cashier's check. He held it up to Coburn's face. "My chapter pooled some funds this morning," Clayton said softly. We bought the diner's original debt outright from the bank, and we paid off the remaining mortgage on the property. Maggie doesn't owe the bank a dime, and she certainly doesn't owe you. Coburn stared at the check, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The realization washed over him. He had been completely outmaneuvered. Now, Clayton whispered, leaning in so close that Coburn could smell the motor oil and leather. You and your boys are going to pack up your little fence. You're going to get in your fancy car, and you are going to leave Coarse Gold. If I ever see your face near this diner again, I won't bring a lawyer. Do we understand each other? Coburn swallowed hard, terrified tears pooling in the corners of his eyes. He nodded furiously. Yes, absolutely. Get out, Clayton barked. The developer practically fell into his Mercedes. His workers scrambled into their trucks, abandoning half their tools in the mud, and peeled out of the parking lot, their tires spinning frantically on the wet asphalt. The two deputies gave Clayton a nervous, respectful nod before quietly slipping into their cruiser and driving away. The suffocating tension in the air vanished, replaced by the victorious roar of 100 bikers cheering and revving their engines. Maggie stood frozen, her mind unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened. The deed to the diner, and her home, was suddenly clear. She dropped to her knees in the gravel, burying her face in her hands as years of terror, grief, and exhaustion poured out in violent, shaking sobs. She felt a heavy hand on her shoulder. Clayton knelt beside her in the dirt, ignoring the mud ruining his jeans. It's over, Maggie, he said gently. You're safe. Why? Maggie choked out, looking up at him through her tears. It was just $33. Why would you do all of this for me? Clayton smiled, a genuine, warm expression that completely transformed his hardened face. Out on the road, survival isn't about how much money you have in the bank. It's about who is willing to stop and help you when you're broken down in the dark. You gave me everything you had when you had nothing left to give. That makes you family. And the angels take care of their family. He stood up and turned to the army of bikers. All right, brothers, Clayton roared, clapping his massive hands together. We've got a diner to fix. What happened next became a legend in the town of Coarse Gold. For the next 48 hours, the Hells Angels transformed from a terrifying motorcycle club into a fiercely loyal construction crew. Men who looked like they belonged in a maximum security prison were suddenly on their hands and knees, scrubbing the diner's floors with toothbrushes. A biker named Grizzly, who had a rap sheet longer than a highway, spent 6 hours rewiring the ancient electrical system. 2 men with heavily tattooed faces climbed onto the roof to patch the leaks, while a half-dozen others sanded down the rusty countertops and painted the walls a cheerful, vibrant yellow. Even Toby was brought into the fold. Clayton sat the boy on the leather seat of his custom chopper, placing a tiny, child-sized leather vest over Toby's shoulders. The boy's asthma seemed to vanish in the excitement, his laughter ringing out across the parking lot as the bikers taught him how to polish chrome. By Friday morning, Maggie's Route 41 diner didn't look like a failing relic. It looked like a masterpiece. The neon sign buzzed brightly, fully repaired. The kitchen gleamed, and most importantly, the parking lot was absolutely packed. The townsfolk, seeing that the notorious biker club had essentially adopted the diner, flocked to the grand reopening out of sheer curiosity and awe. The line for a booth stretched out the door. Maggie, wearing a brand-new apron the club had bought her, flew behind the counter, flipping burgers and pouring coffee with a joy she hadn't felt in a decade. Every Sunday, without fail, The deafening rumble of V-twin engines would echo down Highway 41. Dozens of Hell's Angels would pull into the lot, filling the booths, drinking black coffee, and leaving $100 tips under their plates. Maggie was never bothered by the bank, or a developer, or the local authorities ever again. She had an army of outlaws ensuring her peace. If you walk into Maggie's diner today, you'll see the gleaming friars and the happy customers. But if you look behind the cash register, right above the coffee pots, you'll see a small wooden picture frame hanging on the wall. Inside the frame is a torn $20 bill, a crisp 10, and 3 slightly wrinkled singles. $33. A quiet, permanent reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters on the road are just guardian angels wearing leather. If Maggie's incredible story of karma, sacrifice, and the surprising humanity of outlaws touched your heart, please hit that like button and share this video with a friend to spread the message that kindness always comes back to you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on more gripping, true-to-life stories. What would you have done in Maggie's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. For 6 months, a frail woman braved freezing rain and biting wind to sleep on the dirt of a notorious outlaw's grave. When 1,000 Hell's Angels rode in to forcefully evict her, they expected a crazy groupie. Instead, her single, terrifying confession brought the toughest men alive to tears. Oak Hill Memorial Cemetery sat on the desolate, wind-battered outskirts of Billings, Montana. It was a sprawling graveyard where the frost settled early in October and the ground stayed frozen solid well into April. In the furthest corner, completely isolated from the manicured family plots and weeping angel statues, lay Section D. It was the barren stretch of dirt reserved for the city's outcasts, the unclaimed and the disgraced. And in Plot 404, beneath the twisted leafless branches of a dying oak tree, lay Arthur Caldwell. To the local police, Arthur was a career criminal. To the Billings chapter of the Hells Angels, he was known simply as Grim. Standing 6'4" and built like a freight train, Grim had been the club's most feared enforcer. He was a man composed entirely of scar tissue, faded prison ink, and quiet, terrifying violence. For 20 years, Grim's word was absolute law on the streets, but 3 years ago, Grim died in a hail of gunfire in an abandoned rail yard, and he died in absolute disgrace. In the months leading up to his death, over $200,000 of club funds had mysteriously vanished. Grim had been missing meetings, disappearing for days at a time, and dodging calls from his club brothers. The streets whispered that the great enforcer had finally broken, that he was skimming money to feed a secret narcotic addiction, or worse, that he was cutting a deal with the federal government to save himself from a looming RICO indictment. When his bullet-riddled body was found, the club felt nothing but cold betrayal. There was no legendary biker funeral, no roaring procession of 1,000 motorcycles, no colors draped over a polished casket. The Hells Angels simply tossed him in a cheap pine box, buried him in the unhallowed dirt of Section D, and strictly forbade any member from ever speaking his name again. That was the absolute end of Arthur Caldwell's legacy. Until Clara Mitchell arrived. Clara was 68 years old, a retired elementary school teacher with a shock of silver hair, severe arthritis, and the frail, bird-like posture of a woman who had seen too many harsh winters. She drove a rusted 1998 Ford Taurus, and every single evening, exactly as the clock struck 8, her headlights would pierce the graveyard's fog. The cemetery groundskeeper, an anxious man named Gary Hobbs, first noticed her in early November. He watched from his heated maintenance shed as Clara trudged through the freezing sleet, carrying a heavy canvas sleeping bag, a thermos of black tea, and a small battery-powered camping lantern. Gary assumed she was visiting a late husband, but when he tracked her footprints the next morning, he felt a cold spike of dread in his stomach. The prints led directly to the unmarked, sunken dirt of Grimm's grave. By December, Clara's nightly vigil had become an immovable ritual. No matter the weather, whether it was a torrential downpour or a blinding snowstorm, Clara would lay her sleeping bag directly over the frozen earth of the outlaw's resting place and sleep there until dawn. Terrified of the Hells Angels' reputation, Gary eventually mustered the courage to confront her. One bitterly cold Tuesday, he marched up to Section D, his breath pluming in the icy air. "Ma'am, you can't be here," Gary pleaded, shivering in his heavy parka. "The grounds are closed after dusk, and... Well, do you have any idea whose grave you're sleeping on? That man was a monster. His associates are dangerous people." Clara didn't flinch. She sat on her sleeping bag, pouring a cup of steaming tea. She looked up at Gary with eyes that were terrifyingly calm, the eyes of a woman who had already survived the worst the world had to offer. "I know exactly whose grave this is, Mr. Hobbs," Clara said, her voice soft but entirely devoid of fear. "And I sleep here because this plot of dirt is the only place in the entire world where the real monsters can no longer touch me." Gary backed away and immediately called the local police. But when the Billings PD heard she was camping on a disgraced Hells Angels grave, they refused to intervene. "Let the bikers handle their own messes," the dispatcher scoffed. Inevitably, the whispers bled out of the graveyard and into the streets, eventually reaching the heavy, smoke-stained doors of the Hells Angels clubhouse. Richard "Brick" Henderson, the formidable president of the Billings chapter, was sitting at the head of the chapter table when he heard the rumor. Brick was a massive, bearded veteran who ruled the club with an iron fist. He had once considered Grimm his closest brother, which made Grimm's ultimate betrayal burn all the more intensely. When a prospect mentioned that some crazy old woman was turning Grimm's grave into a shrine, the clubhouse fell dead silent. To the club, it was a profound insult, a mockery of their patch. "Send Wyatt and Dave," Brick growled, not even looking up from his ledger. "Tell them to go down to Oak Hill tonight. I don't care if she's a groupie, a junkie, or just out of her mind. Run her off. If she doesn't leave, burn her sleeping bag and drag her out by her ankles." That night, the guttural roar of 2 customized Harley-Davidsons shattered the peace of the cemetery. Prospects Wyatt and Dave, 2 hulking men eager to earn their full patches, rode directly over the frosted grass, stopping their heavy bikes inches from Clara's sleeping bag. The blinding glare of their high beams illuminated the frail woman. "Time's up, Grandma," Wyatt barked, stepping off his bike and cracking his heavy leather knuckles. "You're disrespecting club property. You've got 60 seconds to pack your trash and walk, or I'm throwing you in the back of your own trunk." Clara didn't move to run. She slowly screwed the cap onto her thermos, stood up, and walked directly into the blinding headlights. She stopped mere inches from Wyatt's chest, staring up at the towering biker. "You boys wear the same winged death head that he did," Clara said quietly, her voice cutting through the rumbling of the engines. "But you don't carry a fraction of his weight. You go back to your clubhouse. You tell Richard Henderson that if he wants me off this dirt, he has to come here and look me in the eye himself." Wyatt stepped back, completely unnerved by the absolute, chilling authority in the old woman's voice. Outlaws thrived on fear, but this frail grandmother had none left to give. Confused and unsettled, the prospects backed off, kicking their bikes into gear and speeding back to the clubhouse. When Brick heard their report, his blood boiled. This wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It was a direct challenge to his leadership, and he was going to crush it. The timing could not have been worse for a public challenge. It was the weekend of the annual Northwestern Run. The Billings chapter was hosting over 1,000 Hells Angels from across the country. Charters from Oakland, Seattle, Denver, and the nomadic factions had flooded the city. The hotels were booked solid. The bars were overflowing with leather and denim, and the streets constantly vibrated with the mechanical thunder of V-twin engines. The story of the defiant old woman sleeping on the traitor's grave had spread through the visiting chapters like a wildfire. It became a point of intense contention. The president of the powerful Oakland chapter pulled Brick aside and bluntly asked why the Billings charter was too weak to handle a trespassing grandmother. It was no longer just about Grimm. It was about the absolute respect and authority of the Hells Angels. Brick's pride could not take the insult. He decided that tonight he would make a public spectacle of the eviction. He would show the entire Brotherhood that no one, living or dead, young or old, disrespected their club. At 9 p.m., the city of Billings trembled. A massive, coordinated convoy departed from the clubhouse. Over 1,000 Harleys formed a miles-long parade of roaring chrome and roaring exhaust rolling through the freezing night streets. The sheer magnitude of the procession was terrifying. Traffic stopped. Pedestrians backed into alleyways. The synchronized thunder of the engines sounded like a low-flying squadron of heavy bombers. They reached Oak Hill Memorial Cemetery, pouring through the iron gates like a tidal wave of leather and denim. The bikes completely surrounded Section D, forming a massive, unbroken perimeter of blazing headlights that turned the pitch-black graveyard into the middle of the day. The air instantly filled with the heavy scent of high-octane fuel, exhaust, and stale cigarette smoke. Over 1,000 outlaws dismounted, their heavy boots crunching loudly against the frosted grass. They stood in absolute intimidating silence, a wall of hardened men, waiting to see how their brother would handle the insult. Brick Henderson unbuckled his heavy leather jacket and walked down the center aisle created by the bikes. He was flanked by his sergeant-at-arms and 5 of his largest enforcers. In the center of the blinding ring of light, sitting on her cheap canvas sleeping bag, was Clara Mitchell. The frost had settled on her wool coat, but she sat perfectly upright. She did not tremble. She did not cry. Brick stopped 10 feet from the grave. He looked down at the unmarked dirt, his face twisting in disgust, before turning his cold gaze to Clara. "Lady, I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing." Brick's voice boomed, echoing across the silent graveyard, so every biker could hear. "But it ends right now. That man in the dirt was a rat. He was a thief who stole from his own brothers. We don't need you making a shrine out of our greatest mistake. You're leaving this cemetery forever, or I swear to God, we are going to bury you right next to him." Clara stood up. Her arthritic knees popped in the cold, but she straightened her spine. She looked at the 1,000 heavily armed men surrounding her, and then she looked directly into Brick's furious eyes. "You call him a traitor, Richard," Clara said, her voice remarkably clear, carrying over the idling engines. "Because of the missing $200,000? Because of the nights he vanished? Because he died completely alone in that rail yard?" Brick's jaw tightened. "He stole from us to save his own neck. He died a coward." "No," Clara said, shaking her head slowly. "He died a king, and he died to save yours." Clara reached deep into the pockets of her heavy wool coat. A dozen bikers instinctively reached for the weapons on their belts, but Brick held up a massive hand, stopping them. Clara pulled out 2 items. The first was a thick, weathered ledger book. The second was a piece of heavy, blood-stained leather. It was a club cut, specifically the bottom rocker patch that read Montana. It was the very patch the club had noted was missing from Grimm's body when the coroner found him. She tossed the ledger and the bloodied patch. They landed squarely at Brick's heavy boots. "My name is Clara Mitchell," she began, the wind whipping her silver hair across her face. "I don't exist on any government grid. For the last 20 years, I ran a clandestine underground shelter called the Harbour House, hidden in the foothills just outside of town. We took in the women and children that the law ignored, women fleeing from the Volkov syndicate." A low murmur rippled through the 1,000 bikers. Every man there knew the Volkovs. They were a hyper-violent, heavily armed Russian human trafficking ring. The Hells Angels had a strict, unspoken treaty with the syndicate. Stay out of each other's way, because a war between them would turn the streets into a bloodbath and bring the full, crushing weight of the FBI down on both organizations. 3.5 years ago, Clara continued, her voice trembling with rising emotion, the Volkovs found our shelter. They realized we were hiding the wives and daughters of men they had murdered. They paid off the local sheriff. They cut our phone lines, and they planned to burn the Harbour House to the ground with 42 women and children locked inside. Brick stared at the old woman, his tough exterior beginning to fracture. "What does that have to do with Grimm?" "Because one of the girls hiding in my shelter was the younger sister of a Hells Angel prospect," Clara said softly. "A boy named Tommy, who died for this club 5 years ago. When Arthur found out that the Russians were coming for his dead brother's sister, he didn't look away." Clara pointed a frail, shaking finger down at the ledger, resting on the frosted grass. "He didn't steal your money to buy drugs, Richard. He took it to buy black market weapons, to forge passports, and to pay off the border patrol. Arthur Caldwell single-handedly relocated 42 women and children into Canada, pulling them out of the fire while you men sat in your clubhouse drinking beer." The silence in the graveyard was absolute. Not a single man moved. The only sound was the cold wind howling through the barren branches of the oak tree. "But the Volkovs weren't going to let it go." Clara's voice cracked, tears finally pooling in her eyes. "They sent their top hit squad to hunt us down. 12 men with automatic weapons. If Arthur brought this to the club, if he asked you for help, the FBI would have launched a RICO investigation that would have locked every single man in this chapter in federal prison for the rest of your natural lives. Your club would have been destroyed." Clara took a step forward, her frail frame practically radiating absolute authority. "So Arthur made a choice," she wept, the tears freezing on her wrinkled cheeks. "He deliberately stole from you. He made himself look like a rat and a junkie, so you would disown him. So the club would have absolute, plausible deniability. And on the night the Russians came for us, Arthur went to that rail yard alone." Brick looked down at the blood-stained patch at his feet. His breath hitched in his throat. "He lured them away from the shelter," Clara sobbed, falling to her knees and placing her hands on the frozen dirt of Grimm's grave. "He fought 12 heavily armed cartel killers by himself, with nothing but a sawed-off shotgun and a revolver. He killed 8 of them. He broke the Volkov enforcement arm entirely, and he bled to death in the mud, completely alone, knowing that his brothers would spit on his memory for the rest of time, just so you could ride free." Clara looked up at the towering, hardened president of the Hells Angels. "I sleep on this grave, Richard, because Arthur Caldwell is the only reason I am breathing. I sleep on this grave because it is the only way I can keep the bravest man I have ever known company in the dark." Brick Henderson stood completely paralyzed. The massive enforcer, a man who had broken bones with a smile and survived decades of gang warfare, felt his vision blur. Slowly, his knees buckled. To the absolute shock of the 1,000 bikers watching, the president of the Billings Hells Angels dropped to his knees in the freezing mud, directly across from the frail grandmother. He reached out with trembling, heavily tattooed hands and picked up the blood-stained leather patch. He clutched the ruined leather to his chest, bowed his massive head, and began to weep. The sight of Richard "Brick" Henderson, a man who had survived prison riots, barroom brawls, and decades of brutal gang warfare, weeping in the frozen mud, sent a shockwave through the perimeter of 1,000 idle motorcycles. For a long moment, the only sound in Oak Hill Memorial Cemetery was the low, rhythmic rumbling of V-twin engines and the ragged breathing of the Billings chapter president. Brick held the blood-stained Montana rocker patch to his chest like a sacred relic. It was the ultimate symbol of their brotherhood, a piece of canvas that men bled and died for, and Grimm had worn it into the absolute depths of hell. Mike Sullivan, the legendary president of the Oakland Charter, stepped out from the wall of glaring headlights. He was an older, heavily scarred biker who commanded respect across every chapter in the country. His heavy boots crunched against the frost as he walked past Brick and gently knelt beside Clara Mitchell. "May I, ma'am?" Mike asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. Clara nodded slowly, her hands numb from the cold. Mike picked up the weathered ledger. He flipped on a small tactical flashlight from his belt, casting a stark white beam over the handwritten pages. The entire graveyard held its collective breath as the Oakland president read the entries. It was all there. Every single stolen dollar accounted for. There were receipts for burner phones, deposits for armored transport vans, and payoffs to corrupt border agents. But more importantly, there were names. 42 names of women and children, complete with their new aliases and the dates they successfully crossed into Alberta, Canada. Mike flipped to the final page. Pinned to the inside of the back cover was a folded, bloody piece of paper. It was a police sketch of a Volkov syndicate lieutenant, and beneath it, written in Grimm's messy, blocky handwriting, was a final note. "The Russians are tracking Harbor House. They want a war. I'm giving them one. Keep the club out of it. Tell Brick I'm sorry for the mess." Mike closed the ledger. He swallowed hard, his jaw muscles feathering. He looked down at Brick, who was still kneeling in the dirt. "It's true, brother," Mike said, his voice carrying a devastating weight. "Every single word. Grimm took the fall for all of us. He bought those people their lives, and he bought this club its freedom, and he paid for it with his own blood." Brick slowly rose to his feet. He wiped the freezing tears from his weathered cheeks, his eyes burning with a mixture of profound grief and boiling rage. He turned to face the massive wall of his brothers. 1,000 men, hardened outlaws from every corner of the country, stared back at him in absolute silence. "Cut the engines!" Brick roared, his voice echoing off the distant tombstones. In unison, 1,000 thumbs flicked their kill switches. The sudden deafening silence that descended upon the cemetery was heavier than the noise. "Take off your cuts," Brick commanded. Without hesitation, Brick shrugged off his heavy leather vest, the patches displaying his rank and loyalty, and dropped it into the frozen mud at the foot of Grimm's unmarked grave. Mike Sullivan did the same. Then the sergeant-at-arms. Then Wyatt and Dave. A ripple of motion swept through the graveyard. One by one, 1,000 members of the most feared motorcycle club on the planet removed their colors, their most prized possessions, and laid them on the cold earth. It was a gesture of absolute, unyielding surrender, a sign of ultimate respect that had never been seen in the history of the organization. They were laying their pride at the feet of a man they had wrongly condemned. Brick turned back to Clara. The frail grandmother was shivering violently, the adrenaline finally leaving her aged body. Brick didn't say a word. He simply unbuckled his thick, fur-lined leather jacket and draped it over Clara's trembling shoulders. "You don't sleep in the dirt anymore, Clara," Brick said gently, his massive hands resting on her shoulders. "You never sleep in the dirt again. From this second until the day God calls you home, you are under the absolute protection of the Hells Angels." Wyatt and Dave, the two prospects who had tried to intimidate her just hours earlier, stepped forward. Their eyes were red, thick with unshed tears. "Let us take you home, ma'am," Wyatt whispered, his voice cracking. "Please." Clara looked down at the grave one last time. "But Arthur, he's all alone." Brick looked at the sunken patch of earth, his expression hardening into cold, unbreakable resolve. "Not anymore. I promise you, Clara. He will never be alone again." By dawn, the quiet city of Billings awoke to a military-grade operation, but it wasn't run by the police. The Hells Angels did not leave Oak Hill Memorial Cemetery. Instead, they took it over, while a heavily armed detachment of 20 bikers escorted Clara Mitchell back to her small suburban home, setting up a permanent, rotating guard detail on her front porch. The rest of the club went to work. Brick Henderson marched into the cemetery management office as soon as the sun crested the horizon. He slammed a heavy duffel bag onto the desk of a terrified Gary Hobbs. Inside was $300,000 in cash, donations collected overnight from every chapter present. "We are buying Section D," Brick stated coldly. "All of it, and we're bringing in excavators." What followed was the most spectacular act of redemption the city had ever witnessed. The club brought in a private crew of morticians and stonemasons. They carefully exhumed Arthur Caldwell's cheap pine box. They didn't move him to another cemetery. They transformed the barren, forgotten corner of Oak Hill into a fortress of honor. A week later, the club held the funeral they owed their brother. The streets of Billings were entirely shut down by the local police, who were smart enough not to interfere. Over 3,000 bikers from across the globe descended on the city. The procession was 5 miles long, a river of roaring chrome leading a custom-built, glass-paneled hearse. Grim was placed in a solid steel casket, draped in the club's colors. But the true centerpiece of the cemetery was the monument. Where the dying oak tree once stood, the Hells Angels had erected a towering, 8-foot obelisk of polished black marble. Engraved into the stone, below the winged death head, were the words, "Arthur Grim Caldwell, a brother, a king, a savior. He walked into the dark so we could ride in the light." Clara Mitchell stood at the very front of the crowd during the ceremony. She wore her thick wool coat, but pinned over her heart was Grim's blood-stained Montana patch, a gift from Brick that signaled to the criminal underworld that touching a single hair on her head meant initiating a war with the entire Hells Angels nation. But the story of Grim's sacrifice had one final, violent echo. 2 weeks after the funeral, the remnants of the Volkov syndicate caught wind that the woman who ran Harbor House had resurfaced. A Russian hitman named Yuri, the brother of one of the men Grim had killed in the rail yard, quietly arrived in Billings. He had been tracking Clara's movements, planning to finish the job his syndicate had started 3 years ago. Yuri tracked Clara to the local grocery store. He waited in his idling sedan, watching the frail woman walk toward the entrance. He reached into his coat for his suppressed pistol, preparing to step out of the vehicle. He never made it past the door handle. The windows of Yuri's sedan shattered simultaneously as 4 massive, leather-clad men dragged him through the broken glass. Before he could even scream, a heavy boot pinned his throat to the asphalt. Brick Henderson leaned down, the chrome exhaust of his idling Harley burning the air next to Yuri's face. The biker's eyes were completely devoid of mercy. "You tell whatever is left of your bosses," Brick growled, pressing the barrel of a heavy revolver against Yuri's temple, "that Arthur Caldwell's ghost is still enforcing in this city. And if another Russian even breathes the air in Montana, we won't wait for you in a rail yard. We will burn your entire syndicate to the ground." Yuri was thrown back into his shattered car and escorted out of the state line by 50 roaring motorcycles. The Volkoffs never returned. Clara Mitchell lived the rest of her days in absolute peace. She never had to sleep on the frozen dirt again, but she still visited Oak Hill every Sunday. When she did, she never walked alone. A convoy of heavily tattooed outlaws always rode behind her, standing a silent, respectful watch over the grandmother and the black marble monument. They had learned the hardest lesson a brotherhood could face, that true loyalty doesn't always look like obedience. Sometimes it looks like betrayal. Sometimes the greatest hero in the room is the one willing to be the villain, carrying the sins of his family to the grave so they can live to see tomorrow. The unforgettable truth about Arthur Grim Caldwell proves that real heroes totally wear shining armor. Sometimes they wear scuffed leather, ride loud motorcycles, and carry the weight of the world in absolute silence. If this incredible real-life story of sacrifice, redemption, and unbreakable loyalty moved you today, please hit that like button. Share this video with your friends to keep his memory alive, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable dramas. Drop a comment below. What would you do